The air inside the auditorium didn't just feel cold, it felt dangerous. It was the 1970s in Hollywood, an era when martial arts were exploding into Western consciousness, caught in a turbulent transition between ancient traditions and modern reality. Every master stepping into the public, I claimed an unbroken lineage of invincibility. Reputation was everything, and the ego was the armor men wore to protect it. But on this specific night, the spotlights casting long, dramatic shadows over the polished wooden stage were about to witness a collision that history books would never officially record. A silent fracture in time where two completely opposing universes would crash into one another. On one side of the platform stood an imposing figure with a massive, unrelenting presence. Fresh from the merciless and hyper-disciplined dojos of Osaka, Japan, this young American had spent years absorbing the brutal mechanics of Tenshin Aikido. His name was Seagal. He stood well over 6 feet tall, a solid wall of structural mass with a cold, fixed stare and a reputation for breaking wrists as naturally as turning a doorknob. He didn't move with the bouncing energy of a sports competitor. He stood erect like an anvil, heavy, rooted, and completely convinced of his absolute geometric superiority over any human body that dared to cross his line of force. Opposite this imposing wall of mass stood a man who, by comparison, appeared almost fragile. Weighing barely 61 kilograms, 135 pounds, with a lean, hyper-defined physique concealed beneath a casual jacket, he didn't lock himself into a rigid stance. He stood with loose hands, feet moving lightly, possessing the deceptive, relaxed fluidity of a feline. This was Bruce Lee. To the world, he was a cinematic phenomenon, the man who had single-handedly rewritten the rules of action cinema. But to the purists, to the heavy men who inhabited traditional dojos, he was an unknown variable. They looked at his cinematic style, his high kicks, his theatrical cries, and saw an entertainer. They saw an actor playing war. Seagal took a deliberate step forward. The floorboards didn't creak beneath his weight. Instead, his center of gravity shifted with a terrifying, calculated grace. He looked down from his massive height, fixing his eyes on Bruce's calm, almost serene expression. The silence in the room became absolute. The faint, low-frequency hum of the audio amplifiers seemed to vibrate through the floor. The audience collectively held its breath, sensing that this was no longer a routine demonstration. The atmosphere was charged with a friction that had been brewing between two conflicting philosophies for years. Seagal broke the silence. His voice was not loud, but it possessed a cold, razor-sharp edge that cut through the auditorium's quiet like a blade. "Kung Fu is fake," Seagal said, narrowing his eyes. "It's pure acting, it's opera. It's designed to look beautiful in front of a camera, but it doesn't survive on the concrete of a real street." The words hung suspended in the air, heavy and insulting. It was not merely a personal attack on the man in front of him. It was a total, direct condemnation of everything Bruce Lee had bled for, everything he had systematically built through his revolutionary art of Jeet Kune Do. It was an attack on the very essence of Chinese martial arts by a man who believed implicitly in the absolute, crushing authority of Japanese grappling. What happened next in the span of exactly 10 seconds didn't just silence the critics in that room. It shattered an illusion. It was a confrontation that ignored politics, bypassed weight classes, and demonstrated the absolute, unforgiving laws of human physics in their purest form. To understand why those 10 seconds became a closely guarded secret among the elite of the martial arts underworld, one must understand the deep, hidden architectural flaws that Seagal brought to that stage, and the invisible, formless fire Bruce Lee used to exploit them. The architecture of absolute control. To understand why Seagal felt such immense confidence standing before the most famous martial artist in the world, one must examine the crucible in which his skills were forged. Long before global fame, box office hits, and red carpets, Seagal was a true outsider carving a path through a deeply closed culture. In post-war Japan, for an American to master a traditional art was rare. To master it to the point of running a dojo was practically unheard of. Seagal had achieved this through absolute, uncompromising dedication to a vision of Aikido that had been stripped of all spiritual softness. In standard practice, Aikido is often romanticized as the way of the harmonious spirit, an art where the attacker's force is gracefully redirected into circular, non-lethal throws. But under Seagal's fierce interpretation, harmony looked like a catastrophic failure of the joints. He didn't care for pretty demonstrations or cooperative partners. His focus was entirely on Budo, the martial reality of immediate, destructive submission. The mechanics of his system relied on an absolute understanding of human anatomy and structural leverage. If an opponent launched a linear attack, Seagal didn't attempt to block the force with his own muscles. Instead, he stepped slightly off the line of attack, entering the blind spot known as shikaku, while simultaneously trapping the attacker's wrist, elbow, or shoulder. By applying precise, isolating pressure to the small joints of the hand through techniques like kotegeshi, outward wrist twist, and ikkyo, forearm control, he could make an entire person's skeleton collapse. The physics were simple. If you control the wrist, you control the arm. If you control the arm, you control the spine. If you control the spine, the man is yours. From Seagal's perspective, this was the only real way to fight. Combat consisted of grappling with real weight, seizing real limbs, and breaking a person's structure from the inside out. Because of this deep-seated conviction, his skepticism toward Bruce Lee's methods was not born of jealousy. It was a fundamental ideological rejection. When Seagal saw Bruce Lee in movies or read his articles on combat, he saw a style he considered dangerously flawed. He looked at Bruce's signature high kicks and shook his head. To a grappler, a leg thrown high into the air isn't a weapon, it's a lever. It's an open invitation for a seasoned practitioner to close the distance, catch the limb, displace the weight, and slam the attacker into the ground, ending the fight instantly through impact with the pavement. Seagal believed real fighting took place at close range, where hands met flesh, and where weight, mass, and leverage dictated the victor. Furthermore, Seagal held a profound conviction in the reality of mass. He knew that in any physical equation, force equals mass times acceleration. $F equals m\a. If two men possess comparable skills, the heavier man wins through pure structural domination and kinetic momentum. Seagal weighed nearly 36 kilograms, 80 pounds, more than Bruce. He possessed longer arms, broader shoulders, and a lifetime of experience dealing with full-force attacks from massive opponents on the mats of Osaka. In his mind, Bruce Lee was a lightweight theorist, a man who spoke brilliantly about combat, but who lacked the physical architecture required to survive a real, heavy grappling encounter. He was completely certain that if he could just get his hands on the smaller man, the fight would be over. The locks would engage, the joints would twist, and the cinematic icon would be forced to submit. But Seagal's fatal mistake lay in assuming Bruce Lee would play by the rules of traditional engagement. The philosophy of the empty cup. Bruce Lee was not a traditionalist, and he had zero interest in defending the honor of classical kung fu forms. In fact, he had spent the last decade of his life publicly tearing down the very concepts Seagal accused him of practicing. Bruce had fought his way through the crowded rooftops of Hong Kong as a teenager, participating in chaotic, rule-free street brawls where classical stances meant nothing. When he arrived in the United States, his legendary 1964 confrontation with traditional master Wong Jack Man served as his ultimate wake-up call. Although Bruce won the fight, he found himself exhausted and frustrated by how long it took to neutralize an opponent who ran and utilized unorthodox movements. That single fight changed everything. Bruce realized that traditional martial arts were a trap, a classical mess, as he famously called it. He saw that styles built walls around men, forcing them to react according to a specific playbook. The Japanese stylist fought like a Japanese stylist. The Chinese stylist fought like a Chinese stylist. But the street didn't care about nationality or lineage. The street was chaotic, fluid, and entirely unpredictable. To survive, Bruce abandoned all fixed patterns and created Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist. His philosophy was anchored entirely in the concept of formlessness. Empty your mind, be formless, shapeless like water. If you put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. You put water into a bottle, it becomes the bottle. You put it in a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Now water can flow or it can crash. Be water, my friend. To Bruce, Seagal's beloved Aikido suffered from the exact same fatal flaw that plagued all classical styles. It was completely reactive and heavily reliant on cooperation. For an Aikido technique to work, the opponent must launch a linear, highly committed attack. A forward punch, a heavy grab, or a direct downward strike. The grappler relies on that forward momentum vector to apply leverage and execute a throw. But what happens when you fight a man who doesn't commit to linear force? What happens when you fight someone who refuses to leave his limbs extended for you to grab? What happens when your opponent offers no fixed target, but flickers on the edge of your vision like smoke? Bruce Lee's entire combat matrix was designed to deny the grappler the one thing he desperately needed: contact. He understood the physics of space and time better than almost anyone of his era. Jeet Kune Do was built around the concept of the stop hit, the ultimate expression of interception. If an opponent twitched a shoulder to initiate a punch or shifted their hips to step forward, Bruce didn't wait to block the incoming strike. He used his superior visual reflexes to spot the telegraph and struck the opponent during their preparation phase. He shattered their rhythm before it could materialize, neutralizing their force while it was still a thought in their nervous system. Bruce also knew that a smaller man could never win a prolonged grappling match against a giant. If he allowed Seagal to secure a double wrist lock or wrap his arms around his torso, the sheer difference in mass would eventually prevail. Therefore, Bruce's strategy rested on absolute non-confrontation. He utilized a highly specialized fluid footwork system adapted from Western fencing, specifically the fast, springy chassis of fencing masters like Aldo Nadi. He stayed just outside the fighting measure, the exact distance required for an opponent to reach him without taking an extra step. Bruce was a master of phantom space. He wanted his opponent to reach into nothingness, overextend their weight, and exhaust their balance trying to catch a shadow. He knew that the moment a giant misses a punch or a grab, his massive weight becomes his worst enemy. His momentum continues forward while his brain tries to brake. In that microsecond of structural dislocation, a giant is lighter than a feather, and that was the exact vulnerability Bruce was waiting to exploit. 10 seconds on the edge of eternity when the words "Kung Fu is fake" finally left Steven Seagal's mouth. A heavy, suffocating quiet fell over the auditorium. The witnesses surrounding the stage, hardened martial artists, actors, and studio executives, felt their hearts drop. This was no longer an academic debate or a friendly display of cultural arts. The challenge had been issued with absolute intent. But Bruce Lee didn't react with the impulsive rage of a street bully. He didn't clench his jaw or drop into a theatrical kung fu pose. Instead, his lips curled into a slight, knowing smile. It was a cold, sharp expression, the look of an apex predator that had just seen its prey step directly into a hidden snare. To Bruce, this was no annoyance. It was a beautiful opportunity, a real-world test of his reality against the rigid structures of the old world. Bruce took a half step forward. His hands remained low, hanging casually near his waist. His hips were loose, his knees slightly bent, abandoning any recognizable stance altogether. He ignored the traditional playbook entirely, offering Seagal no predictable structure to analyze. "Then show me your truth," Bruce said. His voice was impossibly low, almost a whisper, yet it resonated perfectly off the far walls of the room. What happened next occurred with such blinding, catastrophic speed that the human eye could barely process the individual frames of movement. It was a masterclass in human mechanics, a 10-second sequence that dismantled a lifetime of traditional certainty. Seconds 1 to 3. The momentum of mass the moment the invitation left Bruce's lips, Steven Seagal moved. He didn't hesitate. Leveraging his massive reach, he exploded forward, his large hands cutting through the air like iron talons. His objective was immediate and decisive. He sought to clamp his fingers onto Bruce's lead right wrist, execute a powerful, spinning Shihonage four-direction throw, and slam the smaller man onto the canvas with enough speed to end the engagement before it could truly begin. He put his entire body weight into the stride, confident that his mass would overpower any minor resistance. Seconds 4 to 6. The structural interception, but Bruce Lee didn't pull his hand back. Retreating before a master of leverage is handing them victory on a silver platter. It creates a line of tension that the grappler can easily follow to break your balance. Instead, Bruce did something entirely counterintuitive. He shifted with Seagal's forward momentum. As Seagal's fingers made initial contact with the fabric of his sleeve, Bruce collapsed his lead elbow inward toward his own centerline, completely neutralizing the leverage Seagal needed to twist the wrist. He emptied the space. Before Seagal's massive grip could consolidate into a lock, Bruce's rear hand flashed forward. It was a direct lead jab delivered without telegraphing, launched straight from the hip with no wind-up movement. The strike was so fast it appeared as a blur of flesh. It stopped precisely 1 centimeter from Steven Seagal's throat. The kinetic wind generated by the punch unbuttoned the heavy collar of Seagal's uniform, snapping it backward with a loud, sharp crack. Seconds 7 to 9. The pillar collapse as Seagal froze. The primitive centers of his brain instantly recognized that had that punch traveled 1 centimeter further, his larynx would have been crushed. His head jerked back instinctively in a survival reflex, causing his hips to wobble and his weight to shift dangerously toward his heels. His perfect Aikido alignment shattered in a microsecond of hesitation. Bruce gave him no chance to recover. Sensing the structural dislocation, Bruce dropped his weight instantly, lowering his center of gravity beneath Seagal's hips. With the fluid precision of a dancer and the cold calculation of an engineer, Bruce executed a low sweep against Seagal's lead leg while simultaneously driving a short, explosive palm strike into the center of Seagal's chest. It was a flawless application of opposing forces. Bruce didn't attempt to overpower the giant. He simply redirected Seagal's own frantic, backward energy. The laws of classical mechanics are absolute and indifferent to ego. When a massive object losing its balance meets a perfectly timed countervector of force, it falls at twice the speed of a smaller mass. Second 10. The reality of the floor, the air was violently expelled from the giant's lungs as Steven Seagal's back slammed onto the canvas. The impact was massive, a deep, booming thud that shook the stage's wooden planks and sent a visible shockwave through the room. Bruce Lee didn't follow him to the floor, dive into a grappling position, or raise his fists in celebration. He simply stepped back, returning to his original stance of absolute balance. His hands hung loosely at his sides, his chest rose and fell in a perfectly calm, measured rhythm, and his eyes remained fixed on the fallen giant with quiet, detached curiosity. The entire exchange, from the first step to the final impact, had lasted exactly 10 seconds. Anatomy of a fallen titan, the silence that followed the impact was heavier than the fall itself. For several seconds, no one in the auditorium moved. No one spoke. The witnesses stood like statues, their minds struggling to reconcile the immense reputation of the imposing Aikido master with the image of him lying flat on his back, staring up at the stage's ceiling lights. Seagal lay perfectly still for a fraction of a second, his breath trapped in his throat. His entire life had been built on the certainty of his art. He had faced the toughest fighters in Osaka and brought down men much larger than himself through the flawless application of joint locks and throws. Yet in those 10 seconds, his reality had completely unraveled. He realized with stark clarity that you cannot lock what you cannot catch, and you cannot throw a man who refuses to give you a solid surface to pull. He rose slowly, his movements deliberate as he adjusted his heavy uniform. There was no second charge. There was no shout of rage, nor any desperate attempt to reclaim his honor through a wild brawl. The canvas had spoken, and in the world of martial arts, the canvas never lies. The physical truth of the match was undeniable. Seagal looked at Bruce Lee, and a new expression of deep, quiet seriousness replaced the former arrogance in his eyes. He offered a brief, respectful bow, a silent acknowledgement that he had just crossed paths with a level of understanding that transcended the boundaries of traditional styles. This brief, hidden encounter didn't just settle a backstage dispute. It served as a monumental validation of Bruce Lee's entire life's work. It proved that his philosophy of formlessness was not merely an intellectual concept meant for books or movie screens. It was the ultimate truth of human combat. Analyzing the mechanics of that 10-second exchange makes it clear that Bruce didn't defeat Seagal using superior brute force. Had it been a weightlifting contest or a test of raw power, Seagal would have easily crushed him. Bruce won because he operated on an entirely different temporal plane. He understood that speed, timing, and the ability to adapt to an opponent's form in real time will always overcome static mass and rehearsed structure. Years later, when Steven Seagal catapulted to global fame as one of Hollywood's most iconic action stars, his on-screen style remained distinctly brutal and direct. However, if one analyzes the choreography of his early films with an expert eye, a subtle and fascinating evolution becomes apparent. The long, elaborate setups that define traditional Aikido demonstrations, the wide, circular movements and complicated wrist entries, were mostly gone. His movements on camera became remarkably tight, exceptionally short, and heavily focused on direct centerline interception. He had quietly integrated the core principle of Jeet Kune Do into his own martial expression. He had learned the invaluable lesson of the short line. He had learned the lesson of the little dragon. Truth beyond the spotlight's history is often written by the loudest voices, recorded by cameras, and neatly packaged for public consumption. But the truest, most transformative moments in the life of a legend often occur in quiet obscurity, far from screaming crowds and media flashes. The night Steven Seagal stood before Bruce Lee on that empty stage was a powerful testament that true mastery isn't about which country's style you defend or the size of the muscles you bring into the room. It's about your relationship with reality. Bruce Lee left the stage that night not as a boastful victor needing to tell the world what he had done, but as a humble master who had simply demonstrated a natural law of the universe. He had proved that when you empty your cup, when you shed your ego, your traditions, and your rigid expectations, you become completely formless, and therefore capable of moving mountains. Yet, as Bruce walked off that stage and into the cool California night, his mind was already moving beyond the victory. He knew the world was full of men who would continue to doubt his truth, men who would look at his small frame and mistake his quiet nature for weakness. And though he chose to keep the encounter with Seagal a quiet secret to protect the young master's honor, other challenges were brewing in the dark corners of the global martial arts scene. Challenges where the stakes were far higher than a bruised ego. In the damp shadows of the European underground circuit, a young, hyper-aggressive kickboxing champion was making waves. He had watched Bruce Lee's movements, analyzed his footwork, and claimed to have found the single fatal blind spot in Jeet Kune Do's defense. He didn't want a public demonstration, he wanted blood. And the secret meeting that took place between them in a locked, soundproof room in Amsterdam, with only 3 trusted men present to witness the outcome,